Thanks again to Heidi for a fascinating presentation on what's been happening at York. I know there's clearly quite a widespread general interest in a number of issues around costing IT services and things associated around with that. And of course, it's relatively novel, I think, to a lot of universities and university departments. One to whom it's rather less novel is ULCC, University of London Computing Centre, who've been in a rather different situation for a certain amount of time. And so thank you, Danny, for coming along and telling us about what you're doing there. We did as part of the REXO project, which is the predecessor to the CITS project that this seminar is being held under the banner of. We being myself and Peter, we did with your colleague Colin Love, develop a case study on what you were doing at ULCC a couple of years ago. This will, amongst other things, bring us up to date, so I'm fascinated to hear your perspective on it. So Danny will talk through this, we'll have some Q&A, general discussions, and take it from there. Thanks.
Good afternoon all. I'm Danny Bramman. I'm Head of Corporate Services at the University of London Computer Centre. In my past life I was a beanie, so I know how to add up. They don't trust me with light switches, so I'm not a techie at all, but they do trust me to try and cost some of these things. A lot of you probably already know that we were established in 1968 as one of the 3 supercomputer centres in the UK that the government at the time thought HE would need. My iPhone now has more computing power than Ronnie and Reggie, which were the colloquial name for the Cray twins in our basement in Guildford Street. By about 2005 we had a couple of large contracts. One was for the NOC for Janet and one was with the National Archives. They account for about 6% of our revenue. The rest of it was made up by the University of London themselves, who finally decided to use us for their ICT, I suppose about a year before. Then disaster struck. Janet insourced. 40% of our revenue was gone overnight. Luckily, Cheapy came riding to the rescue with some of our costs, but not all of them. We found we had no useful data, no real financial information that was useful to us as an IT business. We were running on an antiquated financial system at the university, and no basis to make effective decisions. The challenges we had: no useful financial information, no understanding of cost and price. We have to sell our services. We're not a typical university IT department in that respect. We've always had to tell them. As Heidi mentioned earlier on, time recording was unknown there. Costs were allocated on the basis of who could afford it, and Janet took a lion's share of those costs. Functional silos with poor communication, desperately in need of good information. The how was more difficult. We found we had to sell internally what we did for a living. And what we did for a living was provide services to people both inside the university and outside the university who had to pay for them. There was a need to collect data. We tried to introduce time carding, worked well in some activities, not well in others. People were reluctant to change. We sat down and modelled our activities with the technical staff, with me sitting there asking a lot of why questions, until we got to the real reason for doing things. Using those why questions, we modelled the costs. What does it look like in terms of pulling out the cost for this? We continuously improved the models over the years. They've probably changed 7 or 8 times in the last 5 years. And strangely enough, we use discounted cash flow techniques for looking at investments. So if we're investing in a piece of equipment, we need to know what it's going to do for us and how quickly it's going to pay back. Boring beanie talks, I'll leave that for the accountants amongst us. I think one of the key elements we identified that was common throughout the cost models: staff costs, equipment costs, so that's depreciation and maintenance, of both hardware and software. Universities always charged out space costs. Our data centre, we were just moving into a purpose-built 600 square metre data centre in the basement of a listed building in central London. It was an iconic building and a very strange place to put a data centre. But it works. Shortly after we moved in, university decided to charge us for our power consumption. So from a costing model where we were in a probably 30-year-old data centre in another old building in the centre of London, we've moved 150 metres or 150 yards, put a purpose-built data centre up, and all of a sudden they say we're going to double your costs. That was nice. You also need to bear in mind the overheads of running the department. You don't always have a choice in how you run things, but understanding the overheads are important. Cost of money. Capital investment doesn't come free in most cases, and it certainly doesn't in our case. And also need to consider the VAT impact of whether you can recover VAT. The link to finance for us was having a comprehensive coding system with appropriate granularity, careful coding of items at the front end, so making sure your purchase orders go to the right place. Try not to do too much off-system work, and regular meetings with our colleagues in finance, one of which I have here. So he's trying to work out what we do in ULCC. Thought I'd have a quick look at elements within that I'd mentioned before. For instance, staff costs. Do you take into account salary, employers' NI and pension costs? Of course you do. What about training? Do you make an allowance for training? Your overheads. Everyone has overheads. Ours are about 150 quid a day per person. Consider the days you've got available to recover those staff costs. And don't forget, people have holidays, people are sick, and people go on training and have to spend time form filling. There are approximately 262 working days in a year. By the time you take off holidays, sickness, training and admin, you're down to about 200. And that's the length of time you've got to recover your staff costs if you're selling them. Quick view of what one of ours look like. So our average day rate at cost works out to be about just over 400 quid a day. Has anybody worked out their labour cost day rates? The equipment, by the way, is just providing a PC to them. If you look at your data centre, you've obviously got your space costs. I don't know if you get charged directly from your estates department, but we do. Our power cost came as I said, something of a shock. But do you know your power utilisation efficiency rating of your data centre? It's an easy way then to work out your costs of power. Have you got a standby generator? How much does that cost you a year? And don't forget the basic costs within the data centre, the cabinets, the cooling, power management and monitoring. As we have to recover and sell everything, it's useful to us to know how much our power costs us. We're looking now at introducing data center information management. It's going to cost about 50 grand, give or take. And I think Heidi mentioned networking. It's a surprisingly high cost, but when you have to sell everything, you tend to know the price and cost of everything. One of the basic costs of us doing business is how much it costs to put a rack in our data center. And they were the costs up to November last year. In October last year, we replaced all our air conditioning, so our PUE is now down to about 1.4, which is going to save us about 90,000 quid a year in electricity. But you know, we've got things in there like the standby generator costs, and that's depreciation, maintenance, and running costs for testing. So, typical 6 amp rack, 42U in our data center costs nearly 4,700 quid a year. One of my colleagues, Steve Nibbs, was up in York. He runs the infrastructure side of our business. He and I have worked closely together over a number of years, and this is his list of the things to remember about costing storage. We've now probably got a storage array of about 300 terabytes. We're adding to it probably 2 or 3 times a year. We've worked out, well, we believe the average life of a storage array is probably 7 or 8 years, but we depreciate over 5. Never forget your contingency and supplier price rises during the year for additional storage. If you're starting on your journey for the first time, my recommendation is everyone's a customer and treat them as such. You've got to sell the process internally to your staff. Time recording is not an option really, it's essential if you want to do this properly. Know your data center costs and the performance of it. Make sure you work at an appropriate granularity. Work with finance, they're not the enemy most of the time. Continuously improve your models and don't be afraid to fail at first. The model's never right the first time round. It's taken us 5 years to put the building blocks in place, so that within a couple of days now we can pretty accurately cost most services we're asked to provide. And that is the end of the formal bit, and I'll happily take questions.
Thank you, Danny. Any questions, please, to Danny on what he and his colleagues are doing at ULCC? Perhaps I can kick off, Danny. Just first clarification, the main purpose in the first place, because you're a standalone unit, you needed to recharge, so you needed to identify the amounts of the recharge to various potential clients. Were there any other purposes, any other uses you've made for this? And I was thinking of things like your decision on moving the data centre, moving from one highly expensive location in central London to another one isn't the only possible option, I would have thought. Did you look at any other alternatives there, for example?
Not really at the time. It was the decision was all based around money, and the building we were in was probably a quarter occupied and worth high 7 figures to the university. It was a no-brainer for them to spend a couple of million quid building a new data centre for us and getting several times more than that by selling the building. There weren't a huge number of options at the time available to us. We have more now, as we've now got a partnership with a good hosting company down in Maidstone that gives us our DR site and also a high performance computing site down there. Whereas at the time it was commercial, and commercial rack prices, we may as well give up and go home, because I think the cheapest price we were quoted was about 13.5 grand for an 8 amp rack for a year. We couldn't survive on that sort of cost. We've got a 210 rack data centre that's currently 95% full.
So even basing it in central London in a brand new purpose-built building, it was still a lot more economical?
Well, it was in the basement of Senate House, so I wouldn't suggest it was purpose-built, but it's a very nice building. Okay. It's just a strange place to put it, if I'm honest. But it works for us. And we found that, a lot of our services have started out as co-location services. People still like to touch the tin and like to own it. So a lot of them have come in as, buying data centre space off of us. A lot of them now have moved to a managed service. But it's still a challenge that people like to touch the tin.
Oh, similar. If you heard Heidi's presentation on the system at York, from what you can put together between that and your system, how similar are your approaches, and how might these translate to any other universities that probably aren't necessarily in the position that ULCC is?
The approaches are very similar in terms of identifying the costs. We've probably been doing it slightly longer, in that all our purchase orders at the front end are coded to a service because we typically sell them. So we've got our own procurement officer embedded, if you like, and we've got our own management accountant who's been with us in various forms in different people over the last 7 or 8 years. Because, to be honest, we were always an afterthought for the university.
Because the points that came, or some of the points that came out of York's experience, was firstly identifying the services. I think you used the term activities, but it sounds as though
it's the same sort of
we're
thing.
Talking about the same thing. But not just the final services going to customers, internal and external, but the intermediate ones. Yeah. The ones that part of, if you mapped it all out as a flowchart, would be clearly in the middle between the costs that finance can tell you, staff costs, licensing, etc., and what you want at the end, which is conceptually what you might charge a customer, whether or not at that final stage actually happens. So identifying the services and then getting the data out of finance, out of anywhere. And there was a particular issue with the hardware costs of depreciation that Heidi described at York. Just wondered, did you have any of that as well?
Less so, because we've always kept an asset register. We've always been able to identify the cost of equipment we've bought. We hadn't until mid-2000s been able to identify which service used that particular piece of equipment. So we had a storage area network and tape silo in Guildford Street. Nobody knew who used what part of it. Now we've got, we're much more sophisticated in terms of looking at what people need in terms of both storage on a storage area network and in a tape silo. So we look at it more generic, and ask the questions at the front end. I think the secret was asking the questions. When we sat down and looked at the services, it's talking to the technical people and asking why all the time, until you can get through all the reticence to talk about what they actually do, and disguising the black magic into something you can understand and flowchart, basically. I love techies, by the way. So I'm not insulting anybody.
If you can say again, please, who you are, just so.
Martin Williams, University of Bath. One of the big differences, it seems to me, between yourselves and York is that you charge and they don't. Do you find by charging that some of your would-be customers look to go outside more frequently than perhaps would be the case in York?
We're not exactly a traditional university from that respect. It's basically an administration hub for the boys' club that is the University of London, with the School of Advanced Study, and parts of it do like to do their own thing. So the libraries, for instance, think that it's more effective for them to own their own servers and keep them in our data centre than it is for us to buy them, manage them and run them for them. It's slowly changing, but it's convincing people that they don't necessarily need to own the tin anymore. We've got a very large virtual setup there, and getting people to buy into that is a question of getting the pricing right initially and then selling them on the service afterwards.
Please, thank you, Emma.
Emma Reynolds from the University of Surrey. Obviously you talked about having to pick up the costs for the overhead for power, and that was a nasty surprise, but do you think that had a beneficial impact on how you managed power, or were you already actually doing everything you could?
I'd like to say we were, but I'd be lying because we weren't. When it became a clear item that was charged to us, it's pushing now £300,000 a year, it tends to focus the mind in making sure that you're as efficient as you can be. We've just upgraded the air conditioning there, and it's reduced our PUE down to 1.4, which...
Is it just the usage side that you're involved in, or are you actually involved in, or your procurement person involved in actually procuring this service? Or is that done at a bigger...
No, our procurement person will procure everything that we need to run the business. We use specialists. When we built a second data centre a short while ago, converted a room, so we brought in specialist outside project managers to help us design the ITT in the first place, to get the best out of it. So we know what we're good at, we know what we're not good at, and building contracts is something we're not renowned for, so we use specialists for.
You do that, not the University of London?
We try to. They often interfere, not always to our benefit, but they do try. But no, we do it internally.
Just staying with energy costs, is that something that is transparent to users in terms of their demands on the system? And is that something that could have an influence on the total amount of energy costs that are incurred?
Not really, because energy costs are you either run the service or you don't. We try and make it very clear to the user their choice of equipment, if it's going to make a difference or not. Which is why we're trying to get everything moved across to virtualization and less physical servers in the data center. It's apparent in the pricing, because if they use an energy intensive piece of hardware, then they'll notice it. But it's more from giving a composite cost to people that they understand.
But the users are getting a single price.
They get a single price for the
price
service.
A piece of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Typically based upon either a user or a gigabyte a year storage. By the way, we're not as expensive as that for storage.
I was interested in what you said about time recording, and that's an obvious difference with York, and I suspect with probably most universities. Time recording is essential. Can you say, well, firstly, how many people are we talking about, and in what sort of granularity and frequency are they recording the time, and how do you actually collect it? Because I suspect that could be something that could be a bit of a problem culturally and organisationally in a lot of organisations.
Culturally, it's a huge issue. It was trying to persuade people that we're not doing a time and motion study on them, but it's a genuine need to work out how much to charge people for their services. They capture it down to half an hour intervals. Some of them use an online time recording system. Some use an Excel spreadsheet. It's personal preference of the departmental manager, basically. Our new service desk system has a time recording function in that we're about to turn on trial to see if it's an easier way of capturing most of the time at a micro level.
So that's going to be done automatically by the system as opposed
that's
to
the
other
plan.
people. Yeah.
It depends how accurate it is.
But up to that, it's down to the individual people, the staff in the centre, to record their time and
Indeed.
and submit it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's about 75 of them who recapture their time in some way or another.
That's I mean, clearly, if I can bring you in, Heidi, because there was this issue of staff time. That was quite a significant cost in York, of course, wasn't it? Total staff cost. And you took this pragmatic approach of asking the people's direct report, rather than trying to go down to that sort of immediate degree of granularity. That was one of the things you had on your slide headed work in progress, I remember, one of half a dozen ways to develop it. You got any thoughts on that? Is that a high priority or one that...
We've thought about doing it with the time and motion study or your checking on the time requirements. We have, however, if we're working on specific projects, we have asked them to keep a note of time on working on specific projects. Whether we'll ever go down the route of getting people to categorise their time. Some universities have, some of the other universities maybe. But it's a different culture. People tend to think of themselves as in the corporate world, keeping track of every 15 minutes.
Is that transparent so that people record the time they can actually see what's being kept?
Some people do record their time anyway, so it's just their own management. But it isn't a departmental thing.
You have any, so the universities, we do it just for projects, we record time on projects, and every month we stick it up on the wall so everyone can see per project what we've recorded against it. So it helps kind of drill into is this an accurate figure. So people begin to take ownership of their figures and they come to me and say, that's too high or that's too low, or actually that person's recorded this for me and that I was actually doing something else. So that transparency has really helped us drill into the accuracy.
But that's only time spent on specific projects?
That's all IT projects.
The rest
all
of it?
Yeah, all
Okay.
IT projects we cost out.
Right.
At least record time against for costing purposes.
Any other examples of time recording? Is that something that anybody else has considered, tried, dropped?
We do it at Imperial College on projects as well, down to the last half an hour. And again, the way that we work is that we have an online time recording system. Every person that works on a project has to record their time on a weekly basis. And at the end of the month, we cost charge that time at a daily rate, which is about £400, so it's quite interesting. And we cost the project up in that way, so it's time plus any other external costs. And each of those projects has a project manager, and that project manager has a budget on that project, and that gets reported at the on a monthly basis, but also at the end of the project. So, this is when a project finishes, we cost it up based on the time and other costs, and then we do a post-project review and the costs go into it. And that's just on the project. We've had that for about 6 years now. And we've just got a culture now, really. If you work on a project and you've got a project manager and you've got a program manager, they're going to be approving your time as well. So we just have that culture now, really. But on the tech ops side of things and the IT services side, it hasn't been agreed that people should time.
It's a hard sell in academia.
Because they do so many little things as well, whereas if you're working on a project, you just say, I've done 7 hours on the project today, as opposed to be doing lots of little bits and pieces.
But it makes them more focused on what they're doing.
Yeah.
An example, when we first costed up cost of a server, the estimate from all the managers in the department, all the team leaders, was about 6 days a year.
Yeah.
After a year, 2 years of time recording, it's actually closer to 3/4 of a day a year, including all the patching. So, their estimates of how long they spent looking after a server was completely out with what it actually was. It's one of the reasons I said it's important, is to understand at a granular, don't count the Mickey Mouse stuff, but look at the big picture. 60% of your costs you need to be able to account for. And it's pretty similar to us as well. Our staff costs are about 60%.
Please.
You mentioned disaster recovery and having an arrangement in Maidstone with a commercial.
It's a commercial supplier.
How long has that been in place?
The new arrangement, probably about 8 or 9 months now.
How has that impacted the charge that you pass on to your customers, your clients, for the services you provide?
Well, we previously were with SunGuard, so it's actually reduced the cost to all of our customers considerably. They are closer to our rack costs than SunGuard were.
So it was outsourced?
It was outsourced. We've always outsourced it to someone. We've taken racks in SunGuard at Heathrow before now. We've actually found a supplier who works better with us and is more attuned to the way we like to work, which is solve the problem.
Can I, without getting too in detail and geekish about this, you mentioned DCF, discounted cash flow techniques,
Yep.
for investment appraisal. For anyone that wonders what I'm talking about, it's essentially a way of translating future cash flows into what they're worth today. Essentially, it's like calculating interest only back to front.
Yeah.
How, we'd like to say a bit more about how that works, and in particular the thorny issue, of course, and we've come across that I think both in the last session and this morning. Yes, it's okay quantifying the costs, you need to pin them down, and that can be quite a lot of work for all the reasons that you and Heidi have talked through. But what about the benefits? Because you're essentially recharging your costs as opposed to charging a market price. Is the benefit simply what you'll be able to charge out at?
To a large extent, or cost savings you can make.
Cost savings to you or to your...
To both, basically.
Okay.
We tend to look at sharing our cost savings with our customers. And they are customers, you know. Let's not beat about the bush. We have to sell our services. The university doesn't, although we're their preferred ICT supplier, there's nothing guaranteed that says they've got to use us. They use us if we can give them the best benefit. And we still don't run things like the student record system. They keep that to themselves. We keep it warm and dry and powered up and do the backups for them, but they don't trust us in actually touching the application. Not that I blame them, because it's a poison chalice.
So your internal customers can go to other suppliers or do it themselves if they find you too expensive.
They can do.
And you can sell to other, you can find other clients to whom to sell your services.
I've got 300 customers, so yes.
Okay. And presumably you can charge your internal customers, the university customers, it doesn't have to be at cost.
It does have to be at cost, which is why one of the reasons we work so hard on the models.
Right. You can't add on a profit margin and charge what the market will bear.
Chance would be a fine thing.
Okay.
We still get measured by it, but no, we can't. For internal university customers, it has to be at cost.
So it's actually more attractive to provide services to somebody outside than somebody in the university if you're looking at it purely commercially from your...
Purely commercially, yes. But whatever we make, we give back to the university. So we've got no nasty shareholders to pay, apart from the University of London, who get it all back to use for their own nefarious purposes, basically in providing HE.
Are you making a surplus?
Yes. I wouldn't be doing it otherwise. I
Well, a surplus, not a break even.
The only way to make break even is to make sure you aim to make a surplus. I say we give all our surplus to the university to pay for a huge library that sits in 15 stories of Portland stone.
Did you have any Were there any major surprises that came out of what you were doing? Again, I'm thinking of the examples with York. They were talking about the cost of the network. And
The cost of the network, you know, I could, when Heidi mentioned it, you can relate to it. You know, edge switches around you know, our buildings. They're less now because the university have sold off a lot of their stock, so we don't have to quite go so far, but a grade 2 listed building takes a lot to keep wired and switched properly.
which is so presumably knowing about the cost of providing network services might have been one of a number of factors in that decision.
It was, and still is to a large extent. We're doing a rollout of Wi-Fi as well, and it's scarily expensive.
And without asking you to compromise yourself, on the last slide you said don't be afraid to fail at first. Any particular useful failures that helped you to develop what you were doing?
I think one of the things that became very apparent to us is that you've got to get the right granularity. We were probably overcosting our hosting services when we moved into the new building, largely because we based it on managers' estimates of time. And as it's still 60% of your costs, if you're out by a factor of 5, it's a huge impact on what you charge.
This was before you got into detailed time recording, as you described.
And we needed a couple of years time recording to make sure that we got the right level of, it wasn't a one-off or an anomaly or an outlier. It was something that was statistically relevant and carried on being so. And
again, on that sort of line about the granularity of the data you're working with, not wanting to tempt fate, but was everything that you were able to get from the accounting system, the finance system, was that both in the right sort of granularity and analysed in the right sort of way for your purposes as a user?
Initially, no. We ran our own system. Don't cover your ears, John. One of the
I'm looking at you as well.
Well, we've been through an aggressive implementation. We used to run, I don't know if anybody remembers MGB from their days, if anyone's in the University of London then, the great green screen that analysed absolutely nothing and you couldn't find anything out. We went to Aggresso, spent a hideous amount of money implementing Aggresso. And one of the benefits was that we had a number of people on the project team that was able to identify and make sure we got the right level of granularity in there. So we compromised on the number of account codes we needed because you don't need that many, but you make sure you've got appropriate departmental and then project breakdowns so that you can add it. You can add projects ad infinitum, so you can take it to the level of granularity you want.
But that's something that typically you'd need to design into accounting coding systems at source.
Yeah.
It's no good coming along and trying to retrofit it or go back through the data afterwards.
No. You can do it, but it's not pretty and it's not pain-free.
It's expensive.
Yeah.
Okay. Unless there are any further questions on ULCC to Danny, or any further thoughts, thank you very much yet again.
You're welcome.
To conclude and bring it together, essentially I just thought it might be worthwhile going through and summarising some of what seem to be the main issues in this. So a lot of these we've talked through already, but from top through to bottom, in deciding what to do, assuming we're all here in the first place. So there's a lot of interest in understanding rather better what's going on inside organisations for a number of different reasons. Partly driven top down by extra accountability, the extra pressure on costs in organisations, partly driven by the technology, probably rather more choices nowadays about how to do things, and the relative cost both of centralising and developing economies of scale, and also putting things out to outsourcees, the cloud or elsewhere, are probably changing, and largely prompted by York's experience, but not only that. What was also heard from from other universities we've been talking to, and I think largely corroborated by what Danny's been telling us about ULCC. If you're thinking of doing something like this, where to start and how to go about it, as Heidi said, start small and don't be over ambitious in the first place, but keep a clear track of what you're doing. Be transparent to yourselves anyway. In the first case, what costs and resources to try to include? Is it all the IT costs, activities in the whole of the university? I think York very pragmatically and sensibly started with what essentially is the central IT functions budget. It wasn't quite as simple as that. They had to reinvent some of the figures, this thorny issue with depreciation and fixed assets, so it wasn't quite as straightforward as that, but essentially it's what Heidi's responsible for. And firstly, as an exercise, as she said, in understanding better what's happening within the function that she'd taken over, and then as a stepping stone to doing more things with it. The further things with it could then expand initially in one of two ways. The obvious way is ask what's happening within the different faculties or the other central services, and try to pin that down. Problem, of course, is that they may not be very keen to tell you, and that what's being done may not always be shown as IT related, particularly if it's the time of technicians within faculties who are spending part of their time running software that's been bought in with research projects. That may be something that has to be done on a case-by-case basis rather than systematised. The other direction to look in, while still staying with what central IT is responsible for, is okay, there are those costs that are in our budget at the moment. What about the costs that we are driving that aren't there? And as I said before, the way that Peter and I got into this was with a project under DISC's Greening ICT programme, which was looking at energy costs driven by IT, which can be very significant, of course, but typically are hidden. How many people here work in IT as opposed to in finance? Okay. Keep your hands up if you can tell me what the energy costs are of the function that you're running. Okay, you are from? You're, of course, yes, Aberdeen still, yes. Okay, you've got your actual energy costs, that's metered through to you? Yeah. Okay.
When just redid our data centre this year, we put all that facility in place, and we've now got per rack, per server, power costs, PUE costs, we can really write down. Purely because we now share it between ourselves or the board and Bramman College, so we need to have that three-way split so we can apportion and charge back appropriately.
Can I ask if you've got any sort of ballpark figure for the cost of setting up all that sub-metering?
I think sort of mentioned 50,000-ish. That's kind of ballpark what we do at.
And so that's helping you to come up with those figures.
That's licensing for the software to actually be able to do it, to actually give us that visibility and to plug all the bits and pieces together to then actually get a number out at the end, a sensible number out at the end.
Okay, all right, so there's a cost-benefit question in there. You've taken that jump, you're getting the data now. Anybody else considering that, looking at that? Yes, it's so you're from again? Sorry, Hallam, yes, of course.
We're just in the process of trying to use data centre at the moment, and it's one of the things that we're looking to build in is getting a better understanding of the cost of energy, how efficient we use it, and where it goes in relation to equipment services.
Okay, so this is coming in specifically with the data centre as opposed to across the whole IT function, yeah? Okay, still relatively novel, I'm hearing. It's something, one of the cases we developed as part of the Rexo project, the last one, along with one on ULCC, was from Manchester University, who had installed, before us getting there, quite an extensive network of sub-metering, largely driven by the people responsible for energy management and valuable in terms of what it was doing, but never really being pulled together and providing the sort of information that could potentially support some ways of, if not actual recharging, then at least creating greater visibility, better information to the people who were doing the things that were causing the energy to be consumed. Now, there was quite an infrastructure in place. It's a very big university, and there's a lot of sub-metering going in. But the costs of that tend to be falling, and the functionality is increasing. Again, the economies, the trade-offs are shifting over time. It's getting more worthwhile to install that extra measurement technology in order to get that sort of better understanding. In the first place, typically for recharging, and the second place for potentially driving further decisions on how you, whether it's manage IT, manage buildings or whatever. So, okay, the population of costs to include. Probably, I'd suggest, the obvious message, keep it simple in the first place, keep it coherent. Know what you're starting with, and then you know what you're working through to. Because essentially York's model was, what are the total costs? Accountants are very good at telling you what you're spending money on, like people, hardware, software, etc. What they can't do, of course, again, as Heidi was saying, is tell you how that relates to the final outputs, services, products going to customers. So it's essentially, if you mapped out the York system, it would be starting with those ledger costs in accounting terms, what you're spending the money on, through to a series of intermediate activities, through to the final activities. And if you then wish to, you'd add relate those to particular customers, and you could charge out. Or you may not do that for various good reasons, but at least you're aware of what it is costing. One of the issues we've regularly confronted, is it really necessary to do all of this, to have this holistic full costing model? There'll be a spreadsheet coming around that Peter will be sending through to everybody here in the next few days. York have been working on the figures again, hence we didn't want to send it out prematurely, but essentially showing how the York system works. But it is, as I've just described, something that starts with all of the costs and ends up with the same figure at the end, so that you do know that what you started with, you're finishing with. In accounting jargon, you can reconcile the figures. Reconciling things is something that gives accountants a lot of comfort and reassurance, because you know you've not missed anything out. You probably need, again, this was an issue that came up when we were talking before about sunk costs and the rest of it, you probably need something that's holistic, brings it all in if you're recharging. That's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to follow, but on the basis that if you're running this as a business, as you effectively are, you need to make sure that whatever you're paying out, you're capturing from one customer or another sooner or later. Then you probably need it if you're doing it for that purpose. And of course, what you've then got is something that's pulled everything together. You've done a lot of the donkey work, you've done a lot of the hard grafting, you've got it there in one place. What is often found when you're taking a decision, and not all of them, you don't have a lot of time to think through and do the data gathering and the research for each of them, sometimes have to be taken quickly. And it's useful to have it there in one place where you're relatively assured of what's there. You don't have to go and ask people for the data and ask them to dig it out from their own records. Essentially, you've got a central facility that you can mine and get out data for specific point decisions. It is more time consuming, it is more expensive. It depends on a number of variables, like how many services you choose to define, and the usual trade-off between more detail, more granularity, and more potential usefulness, but more work involved. And there's always going to be some issue of how you actually share out the common costs. So it's unlikely ever to be something that fully tells you what's causing those costs. It's essentially a way of sharing out the costs as opposed to really fully understanding them. Why you're doing it could of course be to charge out externally or internally. It could be about looking at introducing new services or cutting out old ones. Different sources of supply, doing things in-house. If in-house, is it done centrally, or is a certain amount allowed to stay devolved? Is it outsourced and on shared services arrangements put out to the cloud? Replacing assets such as data centres, big one-off point decisions. And of course this is where you start having to pick through the costs, because it's not everything that you'd have brought into your full costing model. If you're considering something that impacts on the network, for example, huge cost, as they found at York, as you've confirmed at ULCC, that impacts on the network, well, there's a lot of cost there already, but of course that is all sunk. It's already been spent, it's not going to be recovered. Of course, we can take the view that we can simply use that, the investment's been made, and it's not going to be affected by most of what you do in the short term. Of course, when you start looking at longer term decisions, it's likely that there are going to be different loads on the network, and even something that's been sunk many years ago probably would need renewing. Now, you're the experts on that. I don't know how often these things either need to be physically renewed or replaced because they become obsolete, but there's probably a finite life. And even if in the short term there may not be much impact on costs, there's probably going to be a long-term impact. So we're talking earlier on about fixed costs and marginal costs, and should we just try to cost out the marginal costs and ignore the fixed costs because we're stuck with those anyway, they're sunk? Yes, in the short term, but probably the risk of focusing only on what's going to immediately change, you can get caught in the marginal costing mind trap and tend to forget about what in practice is probably a large part of the costs. And of course, whatever it is that could be relevant, you need to have in the right sort of granularity and form. So, policy choices to make, decisions. What are you going to do about the common costs? Most of them will be common, so there needs to be some reasonable way of sharing them out. Do you simply apportion them on the basis of something like staff time, or is there a better way for some items, ways of measuring IT usage? The data you're starting with, and I suspect that's something that's going to vary quite a lot from institution to institution in terms of what systems you're using and the ways that accountants have classified the data in the first place. Capital costs, ongoing issue, how you account for them afterwards, and there may be a disconnect between what the people in finance may be concerned about, which is ultimately what's going to be reflected in the university's overall accounts, income statement, balance sheet, totals on what we call the accruals basis depreciation, and what IT managers are responsible for, which logically, of course, isn't what was spent 4 or 5 years ago, it's what's being spent today. Current spending levels, that may be more sensible for some purposes to focus on the former. If we're looking at depreciation, what are the asset lives that are being taken into account? It's always a guesstimate at the start. Accounting looks as though it ought to be scientific and objective, as most people, you probably all found out, it's anything but when you scratch the surface. But depreciation, of course, you're estimating how long something's going to last for. IT doesn't clearly, given the rate of change, that's going to be no easier than otherwise. Make the best estimate you've got. I think in York they could probably have cut through some of those Gordian knots and not worried too much about how central finance was doing it, especially if central finance didn't seem to know themselves, but simply have taken a best estimate on it. And of course always bearing in mind that what might with hindsight turn out to be an appropriate asset life isn't necessarily the one that is being reflected in the accounting system. How often you do this? Again, Heidi mentioned issues about how often you update this and the problems with updating it. Well, there are different things you can update it for, of course. You can update it for the data, relatively simple, once you've got the spreadsheet built. You can update it for the number of services you're running, a bit more changes to the structure of the spreadsheet, a bit more work. You can update it for changes in the way that those final services are being provided, the hardware, the software that you're running them through. Probably the old Pareto principle, 80-20, you're getting a lot of the value out of simply doing this once. And it's not necessarily something you need to do on a regular basis. Update perhaps depends on the pace of change, of course, but update every 2 or 3 years may be more than enough for a lot of purposes, certainly anything involving strategic decisions, because a lot of this is about being approximately right rather than having no idea. It's not about balancing things to the penny. Something that's clearly close to Peter and my interest, because it's part of what we're being tasked with, is linking IT and finance professionals so that we're able to, if not quite talk the same language, at least understand when the other one's talking gibberish. And that cuts both ways. I speak as a finance person, frequently bamboozled by IT experts. So trying to create some common ground, and part of what we're doing is to develop some training materials that may be of use to initially people in IT, maybe be more generic than that, but in terms of helping you or the people working for you to understand better what you need to do in order to help fit in with what finance systems are, and help to make proposals, business cases, to do the sort of analyses that will both carry the day in terms of the proposals and also make sense in themselves. Any thoughts anybody has on that, what would work effectively in terms of training needs and wishes, be very grateful for, either verbally immediately or jot it in an email very quickly to hear. I think probably the final 2 key principles, whatever you do, be clear about why you're doing it at any point in time and what you're going to use the information for, because it's not one size fits all. Sort of thing that gives accountants a bad name, of course, when you say, what does this product cost? And an accountant wanting to dodge it will give you an answer, a nice, direct, straight answer. The real honest answer, of course, is, well, it depends. Why do you want to know? It's a bit like the old gag about the accountant that was asked by the chief executive what the profit was, and says, well, it depends. What do you want it to be? I'm an accountant. Whatever the profit you're looking for, I can make it that. That's apocryphal, of course. That would never actually occur. Not quite the same here, because it does depend on the purpose you're putting it to. Is it to recharge? Is it to make a decision on dropping some of your existing services, consolidating them? Is it about different ways of sourcing those? And be transparent in what you've done. Whatever you're assuming, whatever basis or portion, be clear on that, so you can always go back and adjust it afterwards, see how sensitive the results of any particular analysis are to that, and be able to reconcile the numbers back to the starting point, because the risk with individual point analyses, point decisions, firstly, as I've said, getting the data quickly, accurately, reliably as it's needed, but also secondly, some degree of confidence that nothing crucial has been missed out. And that's always a lot easier to do if you're starting with something that's more complete in the first place. Some of the things that we're developing and working on, and we'll build into further iterations of what we're doing. Peter, do you want to chip in?
Well, I just want to throw in the next part in. Between the 2 presentations, so forgive me if you talk about this, but this issue of strategic change, I kind of wanted to get away from the incremental accounting. Every year you just roll out so many new computers, let's say, and replace them. I think strategically should be that working with a different model. There's a number of areas where we've been working with people on, we're quite interested in. One is HPC. And particularly the issue of cloud HPC versus a shared service. Storage came up this morning. The issue of desktop, for example, providing multiple desktops within the institution. What's the cost of that? Let's say towards an alternative approach, going more standard desktop. Fewer changes for each individual faculty, let's say. I've no doubt others, and that in a way is my question. You know, if we look at the strategic area, what are the kind of strategic choices that people here are grappling with and feel a better understanding of costs would be quite helpful for them?
Yeah, I'll give you a bit on that. Costs, that's right, Andrew Lee from Bath again. The costs of risk. All of the discussions we've had so far have been about how much it costs to do something, how much it costs to do something else. Certain things have risk. There is a risk in going to the cloud. There is a risk in staying internal. These factors, the risk cost needs to be added in as well as the actual cost.
But is it possible to do that in practice? People think, I mean, you know, obviously risk is important. You've got to think about risk, but does it help to try? You know?
It does. It doesn't. You don't have to be perfect. Just have an estimate which takes you in the right direction.
And it will be the cost, let's say, the service going down.
Yes. If this service were in the cloud and say 100 people's email was lost forever, what's the business cost of that? Approximately.
Has anyone here begun to think about that kind of issue?
It's the kind of question that comes up every time we do a business case, and the question is always there on the business case, what happens if we don't do this? And it's very hard to quantify with any accuracy. We know that a lot of what we're proposing is sensible, sustainable investment for the long term, protecting the student experience, the staff experience, data. It's sensible, but actually putting a number against a probability and a cost of what would happen if we didn't do it is really difficult. And normally we don't put a number in, but we say, okay, this has got a negative NPV. In theory, it doesn't work, but it makes sense because it protects this, this, and this. And we don't really try and say, oh well, 1 mark on a student satisfaction, losing a mark on a student satisfaction survey equates to X amount of pounds, because we don't know. We'd just be making it up.
There's always going to be a judgment call at the end of most decisions of any significance. Anything that can be answered purely by a numeric formula is probably not going to be anything that's that important in the first place. So you're not really avoiding that, and that's not just because we're in the, I'm not quite sure if universities are in the public sector or not. They boast of both worlds in some ways, I think, but clearly not trying to make a profit for shareholders. A lot of companies that are doing that, a lot of significant decisions are equally, essentially, they're not going to be totally quantifiable. You can look at the least cost ways of doing things. You can compare alternatives and say, well, these are the relative costs. Now let's assess subjectively other factors, risks, effects on reputation, impact on staff morale, all the other things that matter. But trying to put an immediate monetary number on them is probably rather counterproductive.
I mean, the thing is, there's 2 levels here. I mean, there's a relatively easy level, which is simply to say, if we're trying to make a choice between 2 options, do we have a handle on the costs of each of those options? And then the second question is then to broaden it out to say, okay, we've got the costs, but what are the other factors we need to take into account, like risk, or like quality of service and things like that. The second is obviously the harder question. And in a way, I suppose, what this project is partly about is kind of feet on the ground, saying, well, if we don't even have a full understanding of the costs that within the institution, the specific costs that are identified, let's at least start with that. And then obviously we can sort of think about the risk issues through different mechanisms. And I think the reality is, and again, forgive me if we've spoken about this, I might have came up with you a bit down here, your journey to ULCC. But the fact of the matter at the moment, for any data centre intensive cost in the sector, is that we're missing 30% of that cost. And the reason I pick on 30%, 33%, is that's what Amazon Web Services estimate is the percentage of their operating costs for their web data centres that is taken up by energy, cooling and power supply infrastructure. So straight away, if you're comparing an Amazon price or a Google price with your internal plans, unless you're taking those things into account. It's a very, very distorted decision. And so in some ways, I think part of the message that we're going to want to communicate as well, obviously all of these questions are important, but actually, in terms of doing something in practice, just do something about the costs that are within the organisation and bringing them together and raising people's awareness of what they are. And then, of course, you can start to allocate them to services, but just getting a sense of where the money is going, strategic way, can be quite important. I don't know how that figure would equate to your figures, Danny. 30-35% is your OPEX of your data centres?
Not that much.
Not that much, what?
Not that much. So probably somewhere between 25 and 30.
25 to 30?
Yeah. It's not a million miles away.
Yeah, but it's still pretty significant.
Yeah, but what you're talking about is the basic make or buy decision. Amazon looks very attractive until you use it for a few months. And then you'd like to cut your risk because it's costing you so much money. It's that, unless you know what your services are costing, you can't do a real comparison.
Except, of course, when most people are making that comparison, they're not taking that 30% into account of their own customers. I mean, how many people here, for example, do pay their own energy infrastructure bills directly?
We just had a little census like that. No, it's quite all right, but not very many, I think.
No.
Aberdeen and some consideration at Hallam, I think. But yes, it's more the exception than the norm. Yeah. Are they ready to?
They had some IT problems actually, so they were slightly getting going.
Surely not. Well, it sounds as though we're probably going to be getting back in together again shortly, so that we can compare notes and conclude. So unless there's any final thoughts, points, issues, remember we're very happy to hear from you. In terms of any plans that you have for the future going forward, any questions, any follow-ups on what we've done today, you'll be receiving, say, the spreadsheet, the conversion of the spreadsheet from York, clearly the structure rather than the details of the data. I was just winding up, Peter. I can't possibly wind up for 5 minutes,
Okay, well,
but I think these people deserve a drink and a comfort break.
Next door, so